45 baby found mother bear, running underground railroad for sick animals, the truth, left everyone speechless. The mist hung low that morning, so thick you could almost taste it on your tongue. Ethan Marshall had been walking these woods for 15 years, knew every trail and creek by heart. But today, something felt different. The usual morning sounds were missing. No birds calling to each other across the canopy. No rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just his boots pressing into the damp earth, and the soft whisper of fog moving between the trees. He'd been tracking the mother bear for 3 days now, not because she was a problem, but because something about her movements didn't make sense. She kept returning to the same area, circling back even when food sources led elsewhere. Bears didn't do that without a reason. The tracks were fresh, maybe an hour old. Deep impressions in the soft ground showed she was carrying weight, moving slower than usual. Ethan followed them deeper into a part of the forest he rarely visited, where the trees grew so close together that even midday felt like twilight. The mist was thicker here, wrapping around the massive trunks like cotton. He could barely see 20 feet ahead. Then he heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound in a specific direction, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He moved toward it, each step careful and deliberate. The clearing appeared suddenly, like stepping through a curtain. One moment he was surrounded by trees, the next he was standing at the edge of a small open space carpeted with moss so green it seemed to glow in the filtered light. And there, in the center, was a sight that made him question everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The mother bear was there, just as he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was the small bundle nestled against her massive form. At first, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe he was more tired than he thought. But as he blinked and looked again, the image remained unchanged. A human baby, no more than 6 months old, was sleeping peacefully against the bear's warm fur. The bear's eyes were open, watching him with an intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. Not a threatening look, but something else entirely. Something that seemed almost like recognition, or maybe understanding. The baby stirred slightly, one tiny hand clutching at the bear's fur, and the massive animal shifted just enough to keep the child comfortable. It was a gesture so gentle, so deliberately careful, that Ethan found himself holding his breath. In all his years working with wildlife, he'd seen mother bears with their cubs countless times. The protective instinct was fierce, sometimes violent, but this was different. This was something he had no framework for understanding. He should call it in. That was protocol. A human child in danger required immediate action. But was the child in danger? The baby looked healthy, clean even. The small face was peaceful in sleep, cheeks pink with warmth. The bear's breathing was slow and steady. Her body curved protectively around the infant like she'd done this 1,000 times before. Ethan's hand moved to his radio, then stopped. What would he even say? That he'd found a bear babysitting? They'd think he'd lost his mind. More importantly, any sudden intervention might startle the bear, and that could put the baby in real danger. So he waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The mist began to thin as the morning sun climbed higher, sending shafts of golden light through the canopy. The baby woke once, not crying, but making soft cooing sounds that the bear answered with low, rumbling noises from deep in her chest. It was a conversation of sorts, one that made Ethan's scientific mind reel even as his heart recognized something profound was happening. The bear's massive paw moved with impossible delicacy to adjust the child's position, and the baby grabbed at it with both hands, giggling. The sound was so normal, so perfectly human, in such an impossible situation that Ethan had to sit down on a fallen log to steady himself. His movement caught the bear's attention again. Those dark eyes studied him for a long moment, and then something extraordinary happened. The bear made a soft huffing sound and tilted her head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost like an invitation, or at least permission. Ethan stayed where he was, not willing to test the boundaries of this strange truce, but he pulled out his phone to document what he was seeing. The camera seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of this moment. How could a photograph convey the feeling in the air, the sense that he was witnessing something ancient and sacred? As the day wore on, Ethan noticed other things. There were no signs of struggle, no torn clothing or evidence that the baby had been abandoned in distress. In fact, there was a small blanket, worn but clean, tucked carefully around the child. Someone had placed this baby here deliberately. But why? And how did they know the bear would care for it instead of— He couldn't even finish the thought. The whole situation defied logic. Yet here it was, playing out before his eyes with a strange kind of grace. The bear began to move as afternoon approached. She rose slowly, so slowly that the baby barely stirred. Then, with movements that seemed impossible for such a large creature, she gathered the child against her chest with one massive foreleg and began to walk on 3 legs. Ethan followed at a distance, his mind racing. Where was she taking the baby? The path she chose was not random. She moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or listen to sounds Ethan couldn't hear. The baby seemed completely at ease, occasionally babbling nonsense sounds that the bear continued to answer with her own vocalizations. They traveled for nearly a mile this way, deeper into the forest than Ethan had been in years. The trees here were ancient, their trunks so wide it would take 5 people holding hands to circle them. The undergrowth was different too, full of plants Ethan recognized as having medicinal properties. Old-growth forest, untouched by human hands for possibly centuries. The bear finally stopped at a small creek, the water crystal clear and cold. She set the baby down on a soft patch of grass and began to drink. The baby watched her with bright, curious eyes, reaching out occasionally to touch the bear's wet nose when she lifted her head. That's when Ethan noticed the others. At first, it was just movement in his peripheral vision. Then he saw them clearly. A fox sitting at the edge of the clearing, its right front leg wrapped in what looked like dried grass and mud. A young deer with a healing gash on its flank, the wound clean and already starting to close. A raccoon with one eye clouded by injury, moving slowly but without fear. They weren't running from the bear. They were waiting? The bear finished drinking and moved to each animal in turn, sniffing them, examining them with the same gentle attention she'd shown the baby. Ethan's hand shook as he continued to document this. His rational mind kept trying to find explanations. Maybe these animals were sick, their natural fear responses dampened by illness. Maybe the bear was simply tolerating their presence, but deep down, he knew he was witnessing something else entirely. The bear was caring for them. All of them. The baby was just one of many creatures under her protection. The fox limped forward and curled up near the baby, who reached out with chubby fingers to touch its fur. The fox didn't flinch, didn't snap, just closed its eyes and seemed to rest. As evening approached, Ethan knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't leave the baby here overnight, could he? But every instinct told him that intervening now would shatter something precious, something that might never be seen again. He thought about Lily Morgan, the veterinarian in town. She was discreet, scientific, but open-minded. If anyone could help him figure out what to do without causing a panic, it would be her. He backed away slowly, marking the location on his GPS. The bear watched him go, and he could have sworn he saw approval in those ancient eyes. The walk back to his truck felt like emerging from a dream. The normal forest sounds returned gradually. Birds calling out their evening songs, squirrels chattering in the trees. By the time he reached the road, Ethan was almost able to convince himself he'd imagined it all. But the photos on his phone were real, the video clips were real, and the feeling in his chest like he'd been trusted with the world's most incredible secret. That was real too. He sat in his truck for a long time before starting the engine, trying to figure out how to explain this to Lily without sounding insane. The drive to town was a blur. His mind kept replaying what he'd seen, trying to make it fit into his understanding of the world. Bears were solitary creatures except for mothers with cubs. They didn't adopt human babies. They certainly didn't run some kind of forest hospital for injured animals, yet he'd seen it with his own eyes. The baby had been healthy, happy even. The injured animals had been calm, cared for. Nothing about it made sense, and everything about it felt important. Lily's clinic was closed, but her truck was still in the parking lot. She often stayed late, catching up on paperwork or tending to animals that needed overnight care. Ethan knocked on the back door, the one staff used after hours. She answered quickly, her expression shifting from surprise to concern when she saw his face. He must have looked as shaken as he felt. Without a word, she let him in and led him to her office, closing the door behind them. The familiar smell of antiseptic and animal fur was oddly comforting, grounding him in the real world, even as he prepared to share something unbelievable. He showed her the photos first, then the videos. She watched in silence, her expression changing from skepticism to wonder to something that might have been awe. When the last video ended, she looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked the question he'd been asking himself all day. What do we do? The baby needed to be reunited with its family, obviously. But how could they explain where they'd found it? And what about the bear, the injured animals, the whole impossible ecosystem of care they'd discovered? If word got out, the forest would be overrun with people wanting to see the miracle for themselves. The bear would be captured, studied, probably separated from the baby immediately. Everything special about what was happening would be destroyed in the name of understanding it. They talked late into the night, going over options, discussing possibilities. Lily had heard stories, she said. Old tales from the indigenous peoples who'd lived in these forests long before the town was built. Stories about spirit bears, about places where the normal rules didn't apply. She'd always thought they were just legends, ways of explaining things people didn't understand. But maybe there was more to them. Maybe what Ethan had found was something that had always been there, hidden, protected by its own impossibility. They decided to go back together at first light. 2 witnesses were better than 1, and Lily's medical training might help them understand what was really happening. Neither of them slept well that night. Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions. Who was the baby's mother? How had she known about the bear? Was this the first time, or had this been happening for generations, a secret passed down in whispers? He thought about all the missing children cases that had happy endings, kids found safe in the woods with no explanation for how they'd survived. Had they all been protected by something like this? The thought was both comforting and terrifying. It suggested a world far stranger and more wonderful than anyone imagined. Morning came too slowly and too quickly at the same time. Ethan picked up Lily before dawn, and they drove to the forest in comfortable silence. She'd brought her medical kit, though what use it would be in this situation, neither of them knew. The walk to the clearing seemed shorter this time, as if the forest was allowing them quicker passage. Or maybe Ethan was just eager to prove to himself that yesterday had been real. The mist was back, thicker than before, turning the trees into ghostly silhouettes. Their footsteps were muffled, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed appropriate for what they were about to witness. The clearing was empty when they arrived. Ethan's heart sank. Had the bear moved on? Had someone else found them? But then Lily grabbed his arm and pointed. There, barely visible through the mist, was movement. They waited, hardly breathing, and slowly the scene revealed itself. The bear was there, lying on her side. The baby was awake, playing with a stick, occasionally offering it to the bear, who would sniff it solemnly before the baby pulled it back, giggling. The injured animals were there too, in various states of rest around the clearing. But there were new additions. A hawk with a damaged wing perched on a low branch. A rabbit with a twisted foot huddled near the fox. The clearing had become a sanctuary. Lily moved forward slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The bear watched, but didn't react aggressively. When Lily was about 10 feet away, she sat down cross-legged on the moss and simply observed. Her trained eye took in details Ethan had missed. The fox's splint was actually quite sophisticated, using the natural tension of the dried grass to keep the bones aligned. The deer's wound showed signs of having been cleaned with something that had prevented infection. These weren't random acts of care. There was knowledge here, instinct elevated to something approaching medical treatment. The baby noticed Lily and made excited sounds, reaching out toward her. The bear looked between the baby and Lily, seeming to consider. Then, in a movement that took both watchers by surprise, she gently nudged the baby in Lily's direction. Not pushing, just suggesting. The baby crawled a few feet toward Lily, then looked back at the bear as if asking permission. The bear made that same low, rumbling sound, and the baby continued forward until it reached Lily's outstretched hands. The moment the child touched her, Lily's eyes filled with tears. The baby was well fed, clean, and showed no signs of distress or neglect. Someone had been caring for this child before the bear, and the bear had simply continued that care. They spent hours in the clearing that day, observing, documenting, trying to understand. The bear seemed to have a routine. She would check on each animal periodically, using her nose to examine wounds, her tongue to clean when necessary. The animals submitted to this attention without fear. When the baby needed changing, they discovered a small cache of cloth nearby, hidden under a root. Makeshift diapers, torn from what looked like adult clothing. Someone had been preparing for this, supplying what the bear couldn't provide. The mystery deepened with each discovery. As afternoon approached, they heard something that made them both freeze. Voices, distant but getting closer. Hikers, maybe, or possibly searchers if the baby had been reported missing. Ethan and Lily looked at each other, then at the bear. The massive animal was already moving, gathering the baby with that same impossible gentleness. The other animals began to disperse, melting into the forest with more coordination than seemed natural. Within minutes, the clearing was empty except for Ethan and Lily. When the voices came closer, they stood and made noise, directing the hikers away from the area with a story about tracking a dangerous animal. The hikers, a young couple out for a day trek, were happy to take another path. That evening, back in town, they tried to piece together what they knew. The baby was being cared for, that was undeniable. But by whom? The bear was the obvious answer, but the supplies suggested human involvement. Lily had a thought that seemed crazy but fit the evidence. What if someone, a mother in desperate circumstances maybe, knew about the bear? What if this was intentional? A last resort for someone who couldn't care for their child but couldn't bear to give them up to the system? It would explain the blanket, the diapers, the deliberate placement of the child. Ethan remembered old stories his grandmother had told about women in the old days who would leave babies in the forest when times were hard, trusting in providence or forest spirits to care for them. Most of those stories ended badly, but maybe, just maybe, some of them ended like this. They decided to research, carefully and quietly. Lily checked medical records for recent births, looking for anything unusual. Ethan dove into local history, searching for patterns, stories, anything that might explain what they were seeing. What they found was fragmentary but fascinating. There were stories, going back generations, about the healing bear of the deep woods. Indigenous tales spoke of a sacred place where the boundary between human and animal dissolved. Settlers had whispered about lost children found unharmed, unable or unwilling to explain how they'd survived. There was even a diary entry from a doctor in the 1920s, describing a patient who claimed to have left her sick infant in the forest during a particularly harsh winter, only to find the child months later, healthy and thriving, in the care of a bear. The pattern suggested this wasn't new. This had been happening for a long time, maybe forever. The bears, perhaps a specific lineage of them, had been protecting the vulnerable for generations. It was impossible, but so was what they'd witnessed. They decided to go back the next day, to try to learn more, maybe even find a way to identify the baby and locate its mother. But when they returned to the clearing, something had changed. There were new markings on the trees, symbols carved into the bark that looked both ancient and fresh. Lily recognized some of them from her research into indigenous cultures. They were warnings or maybe protections. Someone else knew about this place. That's when they found her, not in the clearing but on the path leading to it. A young woman, thin and exhausted, moving through the forest with the determination of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She froze when she saw them, fear flashing across her face. But then she saw something in their expressions, maybe understanding or compassion, and her shoulders sagged with relief. Her name was Sarah, and the baby was hers. She'd been living in her car for months, unable to work after complications from the birth left her weak. She'd heard the stories from her grandmother, who'd heard them from hers. When she realized she couldn't care for her baby anymore, when the choice became surrender him to strangers or trust in the old stories, she'd chosen the stories. She'd been coming back every few days, bringing supplies, checking on him from a distance. The bear had accepted her presence, seemed to understand she was the baby's mother. It was an arrangement that shouldn't have worked, but did. Sarah would sit at the edge of the clearing and sing softly, and the bear would bring the baby close enough for her to see him, but not touch. It was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. She was crying as she told them this, exhausted from the weight of her secret and her circumstances. Lily and Ethan exchanged glances. This was bigger than just reuniting a mother and child. This was about preserving something extraordinary. They spent the next weeks working quietly, carefully. Lily used her connections to get Sarah medical help. Off the books at first, then officially through a charity program. Ethan found her temporary housing, then helped her apply for assistance she didn't know existed. Slowly, her strength returned. The baby, named Thomas, they learned, continued to thrive under the bear's care while his mother recovered. It was an impossible situation that somehow worked. The bear seemed to understand that this was temporary, that the mother would return when she was able. The other animals continued to come and go, receiving care, offering their own strange form of community to the human child in their midst. As Sarah grew stronger, she spent more time in the clearing. The bear began to allow her closer, eventually letting her hold Thomas while remaining watchfully near. It was a transition, slow and careful, from one caregiver to another. Watching it, Ethan understood they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary understanding of nature and nurture. This was about something deeper, a connection that ran through all living things when the artificial barriers were removed. The bear had recognized a mother's desperate love and had answered it with her own maternal instinct, expanded beyond species, beyond logic, to pure compassion. The day came when Sarah was ready to take Thomas home. Not to a car this time, but to a small apartment Lily had helped her secure. She had a job lined up, support systems in place, a chance at the life she'd wanted for her son. The goodbye in the clearing was something none of them would ever forget. Sarah approached the bear with Thomas in her arms, and for a moment the two mothers regarded each other. Then Sarah did something unexpected. She knelt and placed Thomas on the ground between them. The baby crawled to the bear, patted her massive head with tiny hands, then crawled back to his mother. A farewell and a thank you that needed no words. The bear watched them leave, her dark eyes unreadable but somehow peaceful. The other animals had gathered too, as if they understood this was a significant moment. As the small group of humans walked away, Ethan looked back to see the bear still watching, still protecting, still waiting for the next soul who would need her impossible, extraordinary care. They never spoke publicly about what they'd seen. Sarah told people she'd been helped by a kind family in the woods, which was true in its own way. The clearing remained secret, the bear continued her work, and the forest kept its ancient mystery. But they all returned sometimes, individually and quietly. Sarah would bring Thomas to the forest edge and tell him stories about a very special bear who had loved him when he needed it most. Lily would leave medical supplies in a weatherproof box she'd hidden near the clearing, and sometimes she'd find them gone, replaced with herbs she recognized as having healing properties. Ethan continued his work as a ranger, but now he guided people away from that part of the forest, protecting it with careful misdirection and bureaucratic red tape. They had become guardians of something precious, something that proved the world was far more magical and interconnected than most people ever realized. The bear lived for many more years, and when she finally passed, another took her place. Younger, but with the same knowing eyes, the same impossible gentleness. The clearing remained a sanctuary. The tradition continued, and the secret was passed on in whispers and careful trust. Because some things were too important to expose to the harsh light of scientific scrutiny or public sensation. Some miracles needed shadows to survive, needed mystery to maintain their power. The Underground Railroad for sick animals and desperate children continued, run by an intelligence that transcended species, powered by a compassion that needed no explanation. Thomas grew up, strong and kind, with a deep love for animals and an intuitive understanding of the natural world that surprised his teachers. He didn't remember his time with the bear, not consciously, but sometimes in his dreams he felt surrounded by warmth and safety, heard a deep rumbling that sounded like the earth itself singing him to sleep. Sarah never forgot, could never forget, the miracle that had saved them both. Not just the bear's care of her child, but the reminder that kindness existed in the most unexpected places, that the world would provide help in ways that defied all reason if you were brave enough to trust in the impossible. Years later, when Thomas was grown and Sarah was a grandmother herself, she would sometimes return to the forest. The clearing was still there, still active. A new generation of bears, perhaps descendants of the original, continued the work. She would sit at the edge and whisper her thanks to the trees, to the moss, to the very air that held this secret. And sometimes, if she was very quiet and very patient, she would see them, the injured animals seeking help, the bear providing it with that same impossible gentleness. And once, just once, she saw another desperate mother leaving a bundle in the clearing, tears streaming down her face as she entrusted her child to the ancient compact between human need and animal compassion. She didn't intervene. She understood now that this was bigger than any one story, older than any one tradition. This was about the web of connection that linked all living things, the safety net that appeared when everything else failed. The Underground Railroad run by bears wasn't just about saving individual creatures. It was about proving that beneath the surface of a world that often seemed cruel and disconnected, there ran currents of love and protection that transcended all boundaries. It was about faith in the impossible, trust in the extraordinary, and the knowledge that sometimes, when you had nowhere else to turn, the forest itself would open its arms and shelter you. The story spread in the way that true mysteries do. Not through news reports or viral videos, but through whispered conversations between people who'd experienced their own inexplicable moments of grace. Mothers who'd found their lost children unharmed after days in the woods. Hikers who'd been led to safety by animals that shouldn't have cared about human welfare. Rangers who'd seen things they couldn't explain and wouldn't try to. The bear's clearing became a legend that was also a truth. A fairy tale that was also a documentary. A secret that was shared by everyone who needed to know it and no one who didn't. And in the heart of the forest, the work continued. Bears caring for human babies and injured animals. Creatures of different species forming impossible communities of care. The natural world revealing its capacity for compassion that went beyond instinct, beyond survival, into something that could only be called love. It was happening right now, had been happening for generations, would continue happening as long as there were those who needed help and those willing to provide it, no matter how impossible that help might seem. The Underground Railroad for sick animals and desperate children was real, was active, was waiting for the next soul who would need its services. The truth, when Ethan and Lily and Sarah finally understood it fully, wasn't just that a bear had cared for a human baby. The truth was that this kind of care was happening everywhere, all the time, in ways that most people never noticed. The world was full of these sanctuaries, these moments of impossible grace. You just had to know how to look for them, how to recognize them when they appeared. You had to be willing to believe that the boundaries between species, between possible and impossible, were far more fluid than anyone imagined. You had to trust that when you were truly lost, truly desperate, the world would provide help in forms you never expected. The baby found with the mother bear had started as a mystery that needed solving. It had become a revelation about the nature of compassion itself. The truth hadn't just left everyone speechless. It had changed them, opened them to possibilities they'd never considered. It had shown them that the world they thought they knew was just the surface of something far deeper, far stranger, and far more beautiful than they'd ever imagined. And in that deeper world, bears could be nurses, forests could be hospitals, and love could cross any boundary to reach those who needed it most. The weeks that followed Sarah's reunion with Thomas brought new revelations that challenged everything Ethan and Lily thought they understood about the forest sanctuary. It started with small things. Lily noticed that the herbs left in exchange for her medical supplies weren't random. They were specifically chosen, different each time, perfectly matching the ailments of animals she'd treated recently in her clinic. Someone or something was watching, learning, adapting. The intelligence behind it was undeniable, but its source remained a mystery. Ethan discovered more carved symbols appearing on trees throughout a wider area, creating what looked like a network or map. Some were old, covered in moss and barely visible. Others were fresh, still weeping sap. The pattern suggested communication, perhaps warnings about safe paths or dangerous areas, maybe even directions to the clearing for those who needed to find it. Sarah, now stable in her new life with Thomas, couldn't stay away from the forest. She felt drawn back, not out of need, but out of gratitude and curiosity. On one of her visits, she witnessed something that added another layer to the mystery. The bear was teaching. A younger bear, possibly her own cub from years past, was watching as the mother demonstrated how to examine the fox's healing leg. The movements were deliberate, educational. The younger bear mimicked them, clumsy at first but learning. This wasn't just instinct, this was knowledge being passed down, techniques being taught. The sanctuary wasn't just a place, it was a tradition, a practice that bears were actively maintaining and teaching to the next generation. The discovery led them to search historical records more carefully. What they found was stunning. References to healing bears went back centuries, always in the same general area, always described in similar terms. But more than that, they found patterns in missing children reports. Over the decades, children who went missing in these woods had a significantly higher survival rate than anywhere else in the region. Many were found in inexplicably good health, often unable or unwilling to explain how they'd survived. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. The sanctuary had been operating for generations, possibly centuries, saving lives in secret. But it wasn't just bears. As they observed more carefully, they noticed other animals playing roles in this impossible ecosystem. Crows acted as sentinels, calling out warnings when strangers approached. A family of raccoons seemed to manage the supply caches, organizing and distributing materials left by human helpers. Even the trees seemed complicit, growing in ways that created natural shelters and barriers, protecting the clearing from accidental discovery. It was as if the entire forest was conscious, working together toward a common purpose that defied scientific explanation. Lily's medical background led her to document the healing techniques she observed. The bear's saliva, she discovered through careful testing of residue left on bandages, contained unusual enzymes with antimicrobial properties. But that didn't explain everything. The bear seemed to know which plants to gather, which muds had healing properties, how to set bones and clean wounds. This knowledge had to come from somewhere. One theory was that it was accumulated wisdom, gathered over generations of trial and error. But another possibility, one that seemed crazy but fit the evidence, was that the bears were learning from the humans they'd helped, observing medical treatment and incorporating it into their own practice. The younger bear, who they'd started calling Luna, was proving this theory might be correct. She was more curious about human tools and methods than her mother had been. When Lily accidentally left a medical instrument behind, Luna examined it carefully, even attempted to use it on a wounded rabbit. The attempt was clumsy but showed understanding of the tool's purpose. It was like watching the very early stages of tool use in a species not known for it. Evolution happening in real time, or perhaps something else entirely. Something about this place accelerated learning, enhanced understanding between species. Thomas, now a toddler, had started showing unusual behaviors. He was too young to remember his time with the bear consciously, but his body seemed to remember. He was calmer in nature than other children, showed no fear of animals, and had an uncanny ability to sense when creatures were hurt or distressed. Sarah brought him to the forest regularly, and each time animals would approach him without fear. The bear, the original one who had cared for him, would watch from a distance with what looked like satisfaction. She never approached directly, maintaining the boundary between wild and domestic, but her presence was always felt, always protective. One day, they encountered another mother in the forest, not leaving a child this time, but seeking help for one. Her daughter, Jessica Brooks, had been diagnosed with a condition that left her unable to walk properly. The doctors had done what they could, but the prognosis wasn't good. The woman had heard whispers, rumors about the healing place in the woods. She'd come looking for a miracle. Ethan and Lily tried to discourage her gently, explaining that what happened here was about emergency care, not medical miracles. But the woman was desperate, and desperation has its own logic. She brought Jessica to the clearing daily, just to sit, to be present in this space where impossible things happened. What occurred next challenged even their expanded understanding of the sanctuary. The animals began to interact with Jessica in ways they'd never seen before. The fox with the healed leg would lie beside her for hours. The one-eyed raccoon brought her small treasures, stones and feathers and flowers. And Luna, the young bear, showed particular interest in the girl's legs, examining them with the same careful attention her mother showed to wounds. It wasn't healing in any conventional sense, but something was happening. Jessica was happier in the clearing than anywhere else, and slowly, incrementally, she was getting stronger. The improvement was subtle at first. Better balance, less pain, increased mobility. The doctors couldn't explain it. The forest visits shouldn't have made any medical difference. But Jessica's mother kept bringing her, and the improvements continued. It wasn't a miracle cure, wasn't sudden or complete, but it was real, measurable progress that defied medical explanation. The sanctuary wasn't just about emergency care, they realized. It was about something deeper, a kind of healing that involved more than just the physical body. It was about connection, about being part of something larger, about the healing power of belonging to a community that transcended species boundaries. As word spread in the whispered way that such things do, more people began to find their way to the forest. Not crowds, never crowds. The forest itself seemed to limit access. Paths that were clear one day would be overgrown the next, directing only those who truly needed help to the clearing. Each case was different. A veteran with PTSD who found peace sitting among the animals. An elderly man whose dementia seemed to clear when he was in the presence of the bears. A teenager with severe autism who communicated better with the animals than with humans and served as a translator of sorts, understanding their needs in ways others couldn't. The clearing was becoming something more than a sanctuary. It was becoming a bridge between worlds, a place where the rigid categories of human and animal, possible and impossible, natural and supernatural dissolved. Ethan documented it all, not in official reports, but in private journals that read like fantasy, but were grounded in careful observation. Lily studied the medical implications, finding correlations between exposure to the clearing and improvements in various conditions, though she could never identify a mechanism that would satisfy scientific scrutiny. Sarah became an informal guardian, helping guide those who needed to find the clearing while protecting it from those who would exploit it. The original mother bear was aging. Her movements were slower, her fur growing gray around her muzzle. But her eyes remained sharp, her intelligence undimmed. She'd begun spending more time teaching Luna, passing on not just techniques but something harder to define. A philosophy, perhaps, or a calling. The torch was being passed, and everyone who witnessed it understood they were seeing something profound. The sanctuary would continue after the old bear was gone, maintained by those she'd taught, protected by those she'd helped. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp, something extraordinary happened. All the animals gathered in the clearing, more than they'd ever seen at once. Bears, foxes, deer, rabbits, raccoons, birds of every description. Even predators and prey stood peacefully together. The humans who were present, Ethan, Lily, Sarah with Thomas, Jessica and her mother, felt they were witnessing something ceremonial. The old mother bear stood in the center, and one by one the animals approached her. Some touched her gently, others simply stood near her for a moment. It was like they were saying goodbye or thank you, or perhaps both. That night, under a full moon that turned the clearing silver, the old bear lay down in her usual spot and didn't get up again. She passed peacefully, surrounded by all the lives she'd touched, all the creatures she'd healed. There was grief, certainly, but also something else, a sense of completion, of a life lived with purpose beyond the ordinary scope of animal existence. Luna stood vigil over her mother's body through the night, and by morning, the forest had begun to reclaim her. Vines grew with impossible speed, covering her form with green. Flowers bloomed out of season, creating a living memorial that would become part of the clearing itself. Luna took over the sanctuary with a confidence that suggested she'd been preparing for this moment. She was different from her mother, more interactive with humans, more experimental in her methods. Under her care, the sanctuary evolved. She seemed to understand that the world was changing, that the old ways of complete secrecy couldn't last forever. She began to allow more documentation, even posing for photos occasionally, as if she understood that evidence would be needed to protect this place in the modern world. But she was also careful, selective about who she trusted, maintaining the mystery even as she allowed glimpses of the truth. The network of humans who knew about the sanctuary grew slowly, carefully. Each person was chosen, tested in ways they didn't always understand. Those who came seeking profit or fame found the forest impenetrable, paths that led in circles, confusion that sent them home empty-handed. But those who came with genuine need or genuine desire to help found their way easily. The sanctuary had its own intelligence, its own way of choosing who belonged. It wasn't just the bears making decisions. The forest itself seemed conscious, protective, alive in ways that challenged every assumption about the natural world. Jessica, the girl who couldn't walk properly, became a regular presence in the clearing. Her improvement had plateaued medically, but in the forest, she moved with a grace that surprised everyone. She'd developed a special bond with Luna, often sitting beside the bear for hours, not speaking but somehow communicating. She started bringing other children with disabilities, creating an informal therapy program that had no official recognition but profound results. The children called it the Magic Forest, and in a way, they were right. It was magic, if magic was another word for connections and possibilities that science hadn't yet learned to measure. Thomas grew up spending half his time in the forest, developing abilities that seemed supernatural, but might have been natural all along, just dormant in most humans. He could sense when animals were approaching long before they appeared. He knew which plants were safe to eat without being taught. He could calm frightened creatures with a touch. Sarah watched her son with a mixture of pride and concern. He was growing up between two worlds, and she wasn't sure where he would ultimately belong. But when she saw him helping Luna tend to an injured hawk, their movements synchronized like a practiced dance. She understood that maybe belonging to both worlds was exactly what the future needed. The sanctuary faced challenges as the outside world pressed closer. Development threatened the forest edges. Environmental changes affected migration patterns and animal populations. But each challenge was met with adaptation. The clearing moved when it needed to. The bears found new paths. The network of protectors grew stronger. What had started as one bear's inexplicable compassion had become a movement, quiet and underground but powerful. People who'd been helped by the sanctuary went on to create their own versions elsewhere. Not copies, but inspired variations. Urban gardens where homeless individuals found community with feral cats. beach areas where injured seabirds were tended by unlikely caregivers. The idea that care could transcend species was spreading, taking root in places no one expected. Lily published papers about interspecies healing, careful to couch her observations in acceptable scientific language while hinting at deeper truths. She never mentioned the clearing directly, but those who knew how to read between the lines understood. She received letters from researchers around the world who'd observed similar phenomena. Impossible things that couldn't be published without risking careers, but were happening nonetheless. A network of scientific rebels formed, documenting the undocumentable, studying the unstudyable, slowly building a body of evidence that would someday force a reconsideration of what was possible. Ethan's role evolved from protector to educator. He led nature programs for children, teaching them to see the forest not as a resource or a playground, but as a community they were part of. He never spoke directly about the sanctuary, but he planted seeds. Stories about helpful bears that might be true. Observations about how animals cared for each other across species lines. Questions about what intelligence really meant, whether compassion was uniquely human or a force that ran through all living things. The children absorbed these lessons and carried them forward, a generation growing up with expanded ideas about the natural world. The clearing itself changed with the seasons, but maintained its essential character. It was always a place of peace, always a place where the impossible became possible. New animals came seeking help, new humans came seeking hope, and always, Luna was there, growing into her role, becoming even more skilled than her mother had been. She developed her own innovations, using tools humans left behind in ways that showed not just intelligence, but creativity. She began to work with plants more deliberately, creating poultices that Lily analyzed and found to be remarkably effective. The bear was becoming a healer in the truest sense, not just following instinct, but developing actual medical knowledge. One spring, something unprecedented happened. A bear from a different region arrived at the clearing, injured and seeking help. This bear had no connection to the sanctuary, should have had no knowledge of it. Yet, somehow, it had traveled hundreds of miles to find this place. Luna treated the stranger with the same care she showed all creatures, but the implications were staggering. Information about the sanctuary was spreading through the animal kingdom in ways that had nothing to do with human communication. The Underground Railroad wasn't just local anymore. It was becoming a network that spanned distances and species in ways that defied current understanding of animal behavior. The visiting bear stayed for weeks, healing but also learning. Luna taught it her methods, shared her knowledge. When it finally left, it carried that knowledge back to its own territory. Reports began to surface from that region of unusual animal behavior, of bears showing unexpected care for other species. The sanctuary was reproducing itself, not through human intervention but through animal communication and education. The implications were revolutionary. If animals could teach each other complex caregiving behaviors, could develop and spread what amounted to medical knowledge, then everything humans thought they knew about animal intelligence needed to be reconsidered. Sarah watched all of this unfold with a sense of wonder that never diminished. Her son Thomas was now old enough to understand the full story of his early months, and he wore that knowledge like a badge of honor. He was the boy who'd been raised by a bear, even if only briefly, and that experience had shaped him in ways that were still revealing themselves. He had a calmness that other children lacked, a confidence that came from knowing the world was far more magical and protective than most people realized. He was becoming a bridge himself, someone who could walk in both worlds and translate between them. The day came when Thomas, now a young man, brought his own child to the forest. His daughter, barely a year old, had been born with a heart condition that doctors were monitoring carefully. He didn't come seeking miraculous healing. He came to introduce her to the place that had saved him, to the bears who had shown his family that love and care transcended all boundaries. Luna, old now but still strong, approached them slowly. She examined the baby with the same gentle attention her mother had shown Thomas years ago. Then she did something unexpected. She brought other young bears forward, teaching them as she examined the child, passing on the knowledge to yet another generation. The cycle continued, expanded, evolved. The sanctuary was no longer just a clearing in the forest. It was an idea that had taken root in countless places, in countless ways. Every person who'd been touched by it carried its essence forward. Every animal that had been healed became part of the network. The Underground Railroad for sick animals and desperate humans had become something larger, a proof that the world was interconnected in ways that science was only beginning to glimpse. It showed that compassion was not a human invention, but a force that ran through all living things, waiting to be activated by need and proximity. Lily, now elderly, still visited the clearing regularly. She'd spent her life trying to understand what happened there, and while she'd never found answers that satisfied scientific rigor, she'd found something better. She'd found proof that mystery was essential, that not everything needed to be explained to be real and powerful. The clearing had taught her that healing was about more than fixing bodies. It was about connection, about remembering that all life was related, all consciousness was connected, all suffering was shared, and therefore all healing was possible when beings reached across the artificial boundaries that separated them. Ethan had retired from official ranger duties but remained the unofficial guardian of the forest. He'd trained others to protect it without explaining exactly what they were protecting. He'd created bureaucratic mazes that made development near the sanctuary nearly impossible. He'd become a master of misdirection, keeping the curious away while helping those in need find their way. His journals, which he'd decided would be published only after his death, contained the full story. Future generations would decide what to do with the knowledge. But for now, the sanctuary remained protected by its own impossibility. The truth about the baby found with the mother bear had spread in the way that important truths do, not through headlines or viral posts, but through whispered stories, personal testimonies, and quiet transformations. Each person who learned about it had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Some dismissed it as fantasy. Others investigated and found their worldview forever changed, but all of them, whether they believed or not, carried the story forward. It became part of the collective unconscious, a modern myth that was also a documented reality. The sanctuary taught those who found it that the world operated on multiple levels simultaneously. There was the surface level, where bears were just bears and humans were separate from nature. But beneath that was a deeper level, where consciousness was fluid, where compassion was universal, where the impossible happened regularly. Learning to see that deeper level, to operate within it, was the real gift of the sanctuary. It wasn't just about healing bodies or saving lives. It was about remembering what the modern world had forgotten, that all life was sacred, all beings were related, and miracles were simply natural processes that hadn't been explained yet. As the years passed, the sanctuary adapted to each new challenge. Climate change shifted animal populations, but the clearing moved with them. Urban expansion threatened the forest, but protectors always emerged to defend it. Technology advanced to the point where secrets were harder to keep, but the sanctuary had its own ways of hiding in plain sight. Videos that should have gone viral mysteriously disappeared. GPS coordinates that should have been accurate led people in circles. The forest protected itself with methods that seemed supernatural, but might have been natural abilities that humans had forgotten they once possessed. Thomas's daughter grew up knowing the story, visiting the sanctuary regularly. Her heart condition improved gradually. Whether from medical treatment or forest magic or both, no one could say definitively. She developed the same abilities her father had, the same connection to animals, the same understanding that the world was far more alive and conscious than most people realized. She would be part of the generation that finally brought the sanctuary's lessons into the open, that forced humanity to reconsider its relationship with the natural world. But that was still in the future. For now, the sanctuary continued its quiet work. Bears healed injured animals and occasionally cared for human children. The forest provided medicine that science couldn't explain. Connections formed that transcended species boundaries, and slowly, person by person, animal by animal, the understanding spread that compassion was not limited by form or species or any of the categories humans had created to make sense of the world. The Underground Railroad that had started with one bear's impossible act of kindness had become a network of care that spanned the globe, hidden but powerful, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to acknowledge what had been happening all along. The clearing remained, would always remain, a place where the impossible became possible, where bears could be nurses and forests could be hospitals, where human babies could be raised by wild animals and emerge not just unharmed, but enhanced, where the artificial boundaries between species dissolved and revealed the deeper truth that all life was one life, experiencing itself from billions of different perspectives simultaneously. The sanctuary was proof that the world was not just stranger than we imagined, but stranger than we could imagine. And in that strangeness was a beauty and a hope that could sustain those who knew about it through any darkness. Luna's descendants would continue the work for generations to come. Each would add their own innovations, their own understanding. The sanctuary would evolve, adapt, survive. It would remain a secret until secrets were no longer necessary, until humanity had evolved enough to accept what indigenous peoples had always known, that the forest was alive, conscious, and capable of love. The baby found with the mother bear had been just one story among thousands, but it was the story that had opened eyes, changed lives, and proved that miracles were not supernatural events, but natural processes that revealed themselves only to those who were ready to see them. The truth had indeed left everyone speechless, but more than that, it had left them changed. Each person who encountered the sanctuary came away with an expanded sense of what was possible. They might return to their normal lives, but they carried the forest with them. They knew that beneath the surface of ordinary reality was an extraordinary world where bears could heal, where forests could think, where love transcended every boundary humans had ever imagined. And knowing that, believing that, experiencing that, they could never see the world the same way again. In the end, the sanctuary's greatest gift was not the healing it provided or the lives it saved. It was the reminder that the world was alive, ways that modern civilization had forgotten. Every tree was conscious on some level. Every animal had wisdom to share. Every connection between living beings was part of a vast web of consciousness that included everything from bacteria to bears to humans. The sanctuary was a place where that web became visible, tangible, undeniable. It was a place where the truth of interconnection was not a philosophy, but a lived experience. The story would continue long after all the current witnesses were gone. New generations would discover the sanctuary, would add their own chapters to its history. The bears would continue their impossible work. The forest would continue its conscious protection. And somewhere, always, there would be a desperate parent who heard the whispers, who trusted the impossible, who left their child in the care of the wild and found that the wild was more civilized than civilization itself. The Underground Railroad for sick animals and desperate humans would never stop running, because the need for it would never disappear, and neither would the mysterious force that had created it. The baby found with the mother bear had grown into a man who understood that he was part of something larger than himself. His daughter would grow into a woman who would help bring the sanctuary's message to the wider world. And her children would live in a world where the impossible had become accepted, where the connections between all living things were acknowledged and celebrated. The sanctuary had planted seeds that would take generations to fully bloom, but bloom they would. The truth that had left everyone speechless would eventually leave everyone transformed. As the sun set on another day in the clearing, Luna's great-granddaughter tended to a wounded owl while a human child watched and learned. The cycle continued, the mystery deepened, and the impossible went on happening with such regularity that it had become almost ordinary to those who witnessed it daily. But it would never lose its power to amaze, to inspire, to remind humanity that the world was not a collection of separate things, but a single living system expressing itself in countless forms. The sanctuary was proof of that truth, and as long as it existed, hope existed too. Hope that humanity would remember its place in the web of life. Hope that compassion would triumph over separation. Hope that the impossible was not only possible, but inevitable for those who knew how to see it. The clearing fell quiet as darkness approached, but it was not an empty quiet. It was full of presence, full of consciousness, full of the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for healing, for connection, for the miraculous disguised as the mundane. The bears would continue their rounds, the forest would continue its watch. And somewhere, someone in desperate need would hear a whisper about a place where impossible things happened, where bears could heal and forests could think and love, transcended every boundary. They would come seeking help and find so much more. They would find proof that the world was not broken but whole, not separate but connected, not mundane but magical in ways that science was only beginning to discover.